All right, guys, so welcome to Photos at Zoom. I'm Erica McKeehen. I am a curatorial assistant at the museum and a graduate student at Columbia. And today we're going to be viewing Robert Frank's work, The Americans, which sounds like you guys have some sort of foundational understanding of what that is, but it's basically a book of photography that was published in the 1950s by this photographer, Robert Frank. And the museum owns original prints from this book, but typically how we do this print viewing is we lay out the book page by page and look at it in sort of like a sequencing sort of mindset. And that's because he took over 20,000 images for this book and edited it down to 83. So a big part of the conversation is why he chose to include certain photos and why they're ordered in the certain order that they are or paired next to other. So unfortunately, we can't really dive into that part of the conversation of the Americans today because we're not dealing with the physical print, but I really encourage you to, once you know, return to going out in the world, coming to the museum. We're open 7 days a week, free to the public. We have over 16,000 photographic objects in our collection, and you can search our archive at any time online to see the photographers that we have. It's a really great museum, and it's a really great resource, especially for research if you're searching Columbia work. Specifically for this print viewing, it's cool to come in and see the actual works that you're about to see in the slideshow, just because seeing photographs in real life just is a lot more special. Seeing how they're printed, seeing the detail and the crispness. If it was a film photograph, you really get a lot of detail. Seeing sort of like the presence and the impact of a photo in person, seeing how big and it is in comparison to other photos and sort of the size and scale of it. So really encourage you to come in for a print viewing to see this work, or even just to flip through the book, The Americans, and you can definitely find it on the internet. There are tons of images posted from it. It's pretty famous work at this point. But anyway, that's a little bit about the museum. So let's get started about Robert Frank and the Americans. And if at any point you guys want to contribute any questions or conversation around the work that we're looking at, feel free to use the chat feature on Zoom, and I'll see it pop up on my screen. I had like a little technical difficulty yesterday, but I think it should be smooth sailing today. So if you want to ask a question, feel free to use the chat feature, and I should be able to answer that and incorporate it in the conversation. So the first image that we're going to start with is actually the cover of the book, and that's why I like to start with this image. I think it incorporates so many themes about Frank's work, and it has a lot of impact, and it kind of like stares you on directly because you're looking into the faces of all these different subjects. So first I'll tell you guys a little bit about Robert Frank so you have sort of an understanding of who he was. He was born in Switzerland in 1924, and he immigrated to New York after World War II. And he was only 22 when he moved here. So he found immediate success actually as a commercial photographer working for Harper's Bazaar, which I think is a really cool point to bring up because this work is in stark contrast to sort of work that you would see in a magazine like that. But that was his formal background. Overall, his work really has played a significant role in changing the visual language of post-war photography just because of the time that it came out. And his more subjective approach to documentary photography has had a lasting impact on numerous photographers since. So as you look at the work, consider images that you've seen that are very similar, consider how influential his work might have been to other image makers, both photographers and videographers throughout the years. And also, as we look at the work again, I want you guys to think sort of about the countercultural themes that tie it back to sort of what you're studying in your class, and sort of that notion of rejecting sort of the status quo idea of how things should be. So as we look at the work, I'll try to call out different instances of that and do a better job of that than I did yesterday, because I kind of forgot that this class is about the beats and not about photography. So I'll try to make it palatable for everybody. So Robert Frank was given a grant to pursue this work. He was given a grant by the Guggenheim. It was $3,600, which at the time was enough for him to finance a trip around America with his family. He got in his car and drove and took photographs of what he saw in various urban and rural places throughout the country. The MOCP, like I said, we own 3 selects from the Americans, and we also own an additional print that didn't make it into the book, which once we get to that photo, I'll make sure to mention that. This book was released in France first, and then in America the following year. And it was released in 1958. So the first image that we're looking at here of the trolley in New Orleans is a good place to start the conversation, I think, about how we can look at images in general. I think a great place to start is just by saying or asking ourselves, what is it an image of? What are we looking at? And why do we think the photographer took an image of that? So in this photograph, we're looking at an image of people on a trolley, of people of different racial backgrounds, different classes. And I think that's what Frank is really trying to show here. Also, through another theme throughout his work is transportation and sort of modes of transportation, bringing people together. And when you think about it, you could pretty much photograph this scene today. That's another thing I always like to ask or to challenge students to think about is, could these photographs be made today, even though they were made in the 50s in America? Could we see a scene similar like this today? And the answer is yes. In cities, we see scenes like this all the time. When you ride the train or bus, back when we could do those things more frequently, you would see a variety of walks of life. It's sort of this like great unifier. So throughout Frank's work, we see different modes of transportation. And I think really there's a lot of conceptual themes behind that. And sort of this idea of the great American road trip too, which ties us back to the idea of Jack Kerouac and On the Road, and why this work kind of fits in with that. Again, I want to emphasize how this image shows racial and class division, which is definitely a reality of the time and is still a reality. Again, that's another reason I think this image could still be made. And when you think about the 1950s in America, it was a very divisive time. Civil rights was happening, and people of color were not treated with equity. So when we look at these images, I want you guys to sort of think about that too. There's some in particular that deal with that sort of racial tension that was really prevalent in America at the time, and it's important to take note of that. His vision was really critical and personal, which was another reason that this was first released in France and then in America. It wasn't really received well in America. Americans thought that this work sort of showed the dingier, grittier, sort of unappealing sides of life, or not perfect sides of life. So another thing to think about as you look at the work is the fact that some of these photographs have that sort of like quick snapshot feel to them, and they're not perfectly composed. And that was a point of criticism when this work came out. So it was sort of the way he approached the work technically and the way he approached it conceptually, both of them were kind of ripped apart by Americans. So we're gonna move on to this image. So another theme that's really prevalent throughout Frank's work is sort of the idea of America and flags and patriotism. And he has a lot of scenes from parades or demonstrations and rallies. And this is just one of the first of many images that I'll show you guys that are taken in that sort of context. Sort of showing this sort of blue collar versus white collar lifestyle as well. And when we consider the political environment of America at the time, there was a lot of widespread paranoia about communism. And we also have the Beats who are rejecting the status quo and the material culture of things. So there's a lot of conflicting ideas. And Americans are trying to sort of achieve this domestic level of comfort and security. And so the 1950s are kind of thought of as a time that Americans really wanted that familial and financial security. And we had a lot of rich white men in power. Again, could this image be taken today of political leaders? Yes, most of them are represented in similar ways. I'm not sure exactly who these men are in the photo, but that's how I read it. And it's another sort of snapshot into this time and place in America. You can kind of especially tell based on the way that the people are dressed and the fact that these prominent figures are wearing top hats. Let's move on to another political image. So this one was actually taken in Chicago. And I want us to think a little bit about how, I know you guys, I'm not sure if any of you are photographers or image makers, but I haven't really talked a lot about composition throughout this conversation, but I'll try to tie that in as we look at the photographs. It's really important to think about when we look at photographic work. So in this image, we have this man sort of yelling or giving a demonstration of some type. And the way that it's shot is the photographer is down below photographing up. So it kind of gives this vantage point that makes the man sort of seem to have some sort of like power or authority in the photo. That is intentional. Frank definitely is aware of those creative devices when he was making this work. And even though some of the photos kind of have that quick snapshot feel, he was thoughtful and experienced enough to know what he was doing. And to know sort of the mood that he could create through posing or through posing himself in relation to his subject. This is actually a photo that we own. And again, it's in Chicago. I think it's a really striking photo compositionally. And again, we sort of have this theme of patriotism with the flag showing. This is at a political rally. And sort of showing clearly that side of American life, our devotion to sort of like serving public figures and sort of always being aware of where we are socially and politically. I think it's really interesting when we think about composition again to talk about how some of these images really are deliberate in the way that they include the subject's face, and some of them are really deliberate in not including the subject's face. And this is really an example of the latter. So again, sort of that idea of politics in America, showing sort of different sides of life, making us question why he chose to frame this photo this way, what it shows, what kind of story it's telling, and what information we can gather by the details that he's left in, which even though I've given you guys the titles of all of these photos, we might guess that this was at some kind of parade or political rally, given the fact that he's included the flag. Again, another really moving flag image. I like to talk about this one as sort of, talking about composition, but also mood in terms of what you see of the subjects. You kind of see both of these figures in the shadow. One of their faces is completely concealed by the flag, and the other person seems to be aware or at least looking in the direction of the photographer. And that lends us to the conversation sort of about gaze and the subject's gaze, and having a direct gaze at the photographer, and sort of the power that that lends to the photo. There will be some photographs later on, and I really want you guys to consider like that direct eye contact and what sort of impact that makes. I also want you guys to think again about what life is like in America at the time in the 1950s. I mentioned civil rights issues. Brown versus Board of Education is going on, and Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat on the bus. That's all happening in America in the mid-50s as this work is being created. So there's no doubt in my mind that all of that had a huge influence on his choice to include the American flag in so many of his images. As sort of a controversial symbol. So the reason I brought up gaze in the last photo is so that we could really have a conversation, or I guess a one-sided conversation about it in this photo, which is actually Robert Frank's favorite photo. We do have this print in the museum again, and it's really cool to see it in person because you can really get the tonal quality of the photo in person, but you can see it pretty apparently from this digital version as well. So let's kind of talk about the technical aspects of the photograph, and then we'll get into content because the two kind of are one and the same when it comes to this photo. So the technical aspects are such that we look at the sky and notice that it's really, really blown out and overexposed. Meanwhile, the subjects in the foreground are exposed. And that's because Robert Frank had to expose for their skin tone, which caused the rest of the film to be overexposed. At the time, it sort of was inherently problematic that film was calibrated to capture very pale, white, fair skin tones. And so a whole sect of humans were left out of photographs because people of color could not be photographed properly. They couldn't be captured on film correctly. And photographers were constantly having to compensate for this, both in their exposure in the camera and also in their post-production developing in a darkroom. If we were looking at the print viewing of the Americans, there are a lot of photos of people of color that show this, that show sort of like the blown out white background outside, while trying to achieve a really nice, exposure on the subject's skin. So by photographing people of color and showing that, it reveals to us that not only were these people struggling for their civil rights at that time, but they also weren't being represented properly in photography. And that's really problematic. It wasn't really until the 90s that film was able to shift its calibration techniques and actually capture people of color, but some people feel that it's still a problem of the medium. So first, I want to address that because it's really important when talking about this photo. So it's apparent in this photo that the subjects are sort of caught off guard by him photographing them. And I want us to think about like the gravity and the weight of that, of Robert Frank as a white photographer in the 50s approaching a couple of color and taking their photo in a public place, which he is actually allowed to do, despite, what common conception was at the time, and still kind of what conception is of like street photography and photographers' rights in public spaces. But I digress. So sort of think about the racial climate in America at the time and think about how sort of the woman in this photo does not look pleased to have her photo taken. And that's really important to think about. They definitely have this sort of like caught off guard look to them, but they also have a gaze, and they have a direct gaze at the photographer. And so that's why I brought it up with the previous photograph, because I really wanted you guys to think about the impact that has on the photo. how would it be different if they were looking off into the distance in this photograph? Would that feel different? Would it read differently? Would it have the same sort of emotional impact? You know, definitely wouldn't. The fact that they're looking directly at Frank with that expression and that sort of caught off guard look really is what makes all of the impact of this photograph. Shifting now to a different photograph of a couple at the time. This photograph was taken in Tennessee. And so sort of another theme in Frank's work is sort of showing this everyday life, photographing sort of what we would consider the mundane or the everyday. And in showing the everyday, he's able to show the struggle for income and resources. He's able to show us different types of relationships and couples of different class backgrounds, couples of different racial backgrounds, just by taking that approach and showing us sort of everyday life in America. And that was one of the main critiques as well of the work when it came out, was that people didn't want to see this mundane everyday life photography. When people thought of photography at the time, they thought, you know, photos are captured of important events or important people and not just of the everyday. I like this photograph a lot, and I like to include it because I think not only does it contrast to the previous couple photo, but it also is so styled and just sort of cool. This young couple in Tennessee, they definitely sort of have that Beats feel to them a little bit. And I think he's showing a little bit of the counterculture at the time too, by showing that this couple of different backgrounds together. Again, think about gaze in this photograph, the fact that the subjects are not looking at the photographer, they're sort of looking off indifferently into the distance. And that really changes the tone of the photo. If they were both looking directly at Frank, it would seem like a much more confrontational photograph. Sort of on the theme of photographing overlooked subjects and scenes, I'd like to show this photograph of a man getting his shoes shined in a bathroom, because I think that's another scene that at the time Americans didn't really want to see, the sort of like gritty, dingy underbelly of America. But it's true that people work to shine shoes even still today. So Frank was really interested in these sort of overlooked subjects like bars, restaurants, diners, homes. Again, the theme of race and class divisions throughout his work is really apparent in this photograph. And I had someone bring up during the print viewing yesterday, which I thought was really interesting. They were talking about another artist who shows service workers, but in their work, they really show the workers like with a lot of agency. You can see what they look like. The subjects are, you know, in the foreground. And in this photo, we really don't get a lot of detail about either of the men, but we especially don't get a lot of detail about the man shining the shoes, but we can assume that it's a person of color. And we might ask ourselves why Frank kept his distance. Maybe he just kept his distance because he's in a man's restroom taking a photograph. But the distance kind of disallows us that understanding and knowing of the subject. And it kind of shifts us from thinking about the subjects in the photograph to just thinking about the scene itself and what the scene is about. We own this photograph, but this is the one that did not make it into the Americans. And so again, during the physical print viewing, we have this conversation about, you know, out of 20,000 photographs, editing it down to 83, why do you think he chose to include these photographs? And why do you think he left some of them out? Not sure why he left this photograph out, but I do think it fits in with several of the themes that we've already talked about, including sort of those overlooked subjects, you know, in this looks like a store. a convenience store. It also gives us a great window into the time and place because we can see sort of the prices on the postcards and the advertising in the foreground. His choice of framing in this photo is really clever, showing us sort of those layered details that really signify to us that this is taken in a department store or some type of convenience store. And I also like to look at this photo and think about like a woman's role in America at the time and kind of the expectations of women at the time. You know, and kind of, again, could we take this photo today? Are we still struggling with the same sort of, you know, gender biases of women, like in shopping and commerce and in stores? Is that still kind of like a common conception that we have for different reasons, or have we overcome that yet? So again, you know, that statement or that question can really relate back to all of this work, from the shoe shining to the people getting their photo taken on the hill in San Francisco. Like, could those photos be made today, and why? Are we still struggling with some of the same issues and conceptions, and why? Could we find these scenes and go out and find them in the world in 2020? Another really prevalent theme in Frank's work is the street, and sort of this idea of the street in both urban and rural settings as this place, as again, like transportation, this great unifier, and this place where we can see all walks of life. We own this photo, so I definitely wanted to include it, but I also think it's really cool, has this sort of like symbolism built right into it with the arrow and the man walking in that direction. Again, interesting perspective that Frank has taken, shooting down on the subject and making them look very small and inferior against this big building and this like presumed cityscape. I think, you know, Frank really had kind of like a lonelier and more ambivalent vision. And that was another point of critique when this work came out, that it wasn't necessarily like happy to look at all of these photographs. And I don't think we've seen a happy photograph in the bunch. It's not really what his work was about. Again, you know, think about what kind of mood we get from this man walking in sort of this unknown direction. He really did embrace this sort of off-kilter snapshot, unrefined style in his work. And I think that this photo and some of these last photos are great examples of that. So in the 1950s, interstates had just been formed. So driving and travel by car were, you know, novel to Americans and really exciting. And without that, Frank wouldn't have been able to even make this work. So he pays homage to that in several ways by showing the road and the street, like I said, several times throughout the Americans. He revisits this theme of sort of the American identity and the car and the American road trip all being tied up together and being really like prevalent at the time with books like On the Road. Again, you really get this sort of like lonely, desolate, isolated feeling from this photograph, and that's why I really love it so much. Any photograph that shows sort of like an overlooked place with no people in it really speaks to me for some reason. I really like ending on this photograph because I think it brings so many of the themes together. You know, cars, roads, modes of transportation, travel as a means to transfer ideas, the style of the photograph, the fact that it's really dark and kind of blurry, but it's still included in the American, so that is always a great conversation topic too. Again, talking about sort of his technical capacities and his technical choices and how that impacts how we receive the work. So it's kind of interesting to think about why this photo made the edit, but it does have a very dark mood to it. And when we think about America, like at the time, as I've said, it's sort of fraught with conflict, racially, and America is dark at the time, and this was a dark period. And I think that this photo really captures that, and conveys what America felt like at the time, and it conveys this sort of like idea of hope and this unexplored territory of what's to come as well. So even though it is sort of like a darker image, I think the light and the sky, and directional aspect of it sort of give us momentum. It's not the last photo in the book, but unfortunately it is the last photo of this presentation. But I just want to end with some key takeaways for you guys, just so I can kind of help to summarize some of the things that I've said today. So the Americans, we can just think about it like a special document of a time in American history that had a lot of division and conflict. But as we look at these images and digest their content and really think about their meaning, we should consider how the current socio-political landscape is today and what we can take away from this work and sort of the ethic of people like Robert Frank and Jack Kerouac and the Beats, who challenged conformity and the idea of systems, and who sort of challenged normative ideas. So on that note, that is the end of my presentation. Thank you guys so much for listening. I would encourage you to check out other photos at Zoom that we have available through the museum's website. Tomorrow we have a studio visit with a photographer named Mark Klett at 12 p.m. And then we also have Kristen Taylor giving a presentation on staged and constructed images on April 22nd. All of these things are available for free on our website, and we're going to definitely continue to do them as we, wear this strange time together. But it's really a great time to engage with the museum if you've never done that before, because we have a ton of really great virtual content.